Greetings everybody, and peace be upon those who follow guidance. Welcome to today's video, where we are going to be breaking down Apostate Aladdin's recent video on Surat al-Hujurat, more specifically verse 6, wherein he lays out a foundation for his understanding of the verse, and then ends the video with outside contextual commentary, which according to him,
which really helps drive my point home, and as a bonus it highlights some of Prophet Muhammad's many flaws.
As one of his main points was that this chapter did not contain a context, allow me to provide the actual context from the chapter itself. Though the full backstory is not given in its entirety, I would object that there is more than enough information in the chapter for us to construct what might have actually taken place at the time. When one breaks up the verses and assumes that the verses are disconnected, then this is where they fall into error when it comes to understanding the Quran. Just because a chapter may not seem to provide a chronology of events, that does not mean that it does not provide the backstory to the events it recounts. So in this response, I am going to first provide the actual context on the chapter as a whole, and then break down the first 8 verses, and lastly, I will end by commenting on some of the points he puts forward. Okay, let us begin. When the Prophet migrated to the city of Medina, called Yathrib at the time, he along with his companions, he was taken in by the inhabitants of Medina, who later on were designated the title al-Ansar, the helping natives. These people were made up of several tribes and clans, some of which did not see eye to eye. Many of them were drawn to the message of the Prophet, and so they quickly converted to his cause. Some were genuine and others were not. One day, 2 factions fell into a dispute, where a mischievous member from one of the tribes sought to capitalize on the unstable foundation between them, and would spread false rumors and gossip between the tribes. Whenever a tribe would hear a rumor, it would retaliate with even more offensive and slanderous retorts, neither one of the two ever coming to a resolution. The 2 factions became so paranoid and suspicious of each other that they started intruding on each other in private, seeking to discover harmful information which they may relate to the public. At this point, the situation had escalated beyond reproach, and it got so out of hand, that even the women were not spared from the uproar. They too began hurling insults at each other and defaming one another, and no sooner than later, swords were being drawn, and the 2 factions were ready to go to war. As they had just adopted the cause of the Prophet, they were not firmly rooted in the faith as of yet, and so they did not have the civility embodied by those who had emigrated with the Prophet. They sought to inquire of the Prophet on the issue, and whether he would join them in the fight. This then led to those who were of less civility, to summon the Prophet from behind their complexes. The Prophet had let them know that he would come out to them, however they were impatient, so they began calling out to him in such a manner that was unbecoming for a people to their leader. Though the Prophet did not mind them at the time. When he had gone out to them, he inquired of what had transpired between them, but instead of informing him in a calm manner, they began screaming at each other and raising their voices, with each group accusing one another of things which the other knew nothing about. When the Prophet had finally grasped what had transpired, he was reluctant to get involved in such a violent altercation between the tribes, as this would impact the whole community. He advocated for a peaceful resolution, but some of the Bedouins began accusing him of siding with their rival tribe. They began appealing to what they viewed as a favor to the Prophet, namely that they had become faithful and had adopted monotheism as a courtesy to him, and they told him that they could leave it just as quickly as they had entered it. When the Prophet had reasoned with them, they were able to get to their senses, and finally see why taking such an action would have been disastrous for them. And in response to this incident, the entirety of Surat al-Hujurat was sent down. Verses 1 to 5 deal with the etiquette and decorum that the people of the faith espoused during the incident while in presence of the Prophet. Verses 6 to 13 deal with the incident itself, as well as its summation, and verses 14 to 18 deal with what true faith encompasses and who the true faithful are. The chapter reads as follows. In the name of God, the Divine Sovereign, the Merciful. O people of the faith, do not take action ahead of God and His Messenger, but do keep God in mind, as assuredly, God is indeed hearing, knowing. O people of the faith, do not raise your voices above the voice of the prophet, nor should you be blunt with him in speech as you are blunt with one another, lest your works should become fruitless while you do not perceive. Assuredly, those who lower their voices in the presence of the messenger of God, such people are they whose hearts God has examined for discipline. For them in wait is forgiveness and a momentous reward. Assuredly, those who summon thee, O Muhammad, from behind the apartment complexes, the majority of them have no common sense. For had they been patient until thou had gone out to them, it would have been better for them, but God is forgiving, merciful. The chapter begins with these first 5 verses, as they comment on the decorum of the people during the incident. Since the prophet was to function as the leader of the community of the faithful, a level of respect was to be rightfully accredited him. In the first verse, God informs the people of the faith that they are not to take action in an endeavor which involved the entire community without having consulted with him, and after he had given them the go-ahead. This is in reference to those people who saw it fit to agree on fighting their brethren without the prophet's authorization or even consultation, as we see in verse 9. Within a given country, no major decisions that impact the entire country and its people are taken without the president's or prime minister's or king's authorization. Similarly, the people of the faith were likewise instructed to not undertake such a decision without the prophet's authorization, so as to maintain order and respect of the hierarchy within the society. The leader should have the final say on such matters which affect the community. Likewise, while they are speaking with the prophet or consulting with him, they are to not raise their voices above his voice. It is in reference to those who raised their voices when the prophet had gone out to them, and was trying to understand what they were saying. However, they were so heated in the moment that they completely forgot that the messenger was among them, and so they were screaming and shouting at each other that the prophet could not fully understand what had truly transpired between them. Not raising one's voice is a self-understood and self-evident respect that is maintained between king and subject, between president and civilian, between master and servant, and likewise it also was to be maintained between prophet and his people. The manner in which one speaks with their friends and peers is not the same way that one speaks to the leader of the nation, to their boss at work, to their schoolteacher, to their headmaster, or to their parents. There is a line that one is not supposed to cross, a line that both the leader and the subject fully understand, which means that when I speak to my boss at work, I am not as blunt in my speech with my boss as I am with my peers, out of respect of the hierarchy and professionalism. The same also extended to the prophet. When the people approached him with whatever inquiries they had, they were to approach him in a way that was neither disrespectful, nor as blunt in speech as one is with their own peers. A respectful decorum was to be maintained, as not doing so, would have ultimately led to one's works and efforts to be fruitless. If they were to raise their voices to him, it is only expected that his attitude would be affected to a certain degree, and that in turn would have made their efforts to get his full attention the less likely. As we saw in the context of the chapter. When the prophet was among them, they were shouting and raising their voices over one another, that their efforts to get their point across yielded no results. They were speaking to him as one speaks to their own peers. On the other hand, those who lower their voices, they are better suited for resolving their issues and getting their work done. Such people, God has appropriated their hearts to discipline and caution in whatever they do, and so for them, he has prepared forgiveness and a great reward. And as for those with less civility, who relentlessly called out from their building complexes, summoning the prophet to come out to them, many of them had absolutely no common sense at all. It is in reference to those people who had made the decision to go and fight ahead of the messenger, and afterward summoned the messenger to join them from behind their apartment complexes, and even after he had informed them that he would come out to them, they still insisted on addressing him in such a manner that was unbecoming for a people to their leader. It is possible they did not intend any malice behind their approach, and it was just because they were uncivilized as compared to those who had emigrated with the prophet, but alas, God was in the end forgiving and merciful to them. The following verses then deal with the reason why the people acted as they acted during the incident as told in the first 5 verses. The verses state as follows. O people of the faith, when a shady person comes to you with some news, then ascertain, lest you should inflict harm on a people out of chauvinism, and thereafter become regretful over what you did. And do keep in mind that within your midst is the messenger of God. If he were to have complied with you in much of the ordeal, then you surely would have self-destructed. However, God made faith beloved to you and beautified it in your hearts, and he made the suppression of good distasteful to you, as well as shady character and disobedience. Those are they who are the right-minded. As a gracious bounty from God and a favor, for God is knowing, wise. In these 3 verses, we are given a backstory to the altercation that led up to the decision to fight in verse 9. We are told that a shady person, a fusik, someone with ill intent, came with some news, the kind of which could have led to the people of the faith inflicting harm on another people out of chauvinism, i.e., jahala, which is typically rendered as ignorance. However, this is actually a very limited rendition of the word. It rather refers to the excessive and prejudiced support of one's own cause or group, here being their own tribe. Out of chauvinism, pride, and dignity of the tribe, they saw it fit to respond in a more harmful manner, and this is what this shady and malicious person was banking on. He knew how they would react, and so he preemptively sought to agitate them, as he knew that they would respond in a hostile manner. Similar to how some people seek to stir up violence by agitating a certain group of people. Their main intent is merely to cause chaos and uproar. Not because they are looking to bring about anything valuable or meaningful or conciliatory. Therefore, when such an individual comes with some news, especially news that might affect the entire community, then the people of the faith must ascertain. This is not in reference to any non-Muslim, or Aladdin's attempt at smearing the text by claiming that it referred to any person who was not a member of the community of Muhammad. A fusik can even be a believer in God and in the Prophet, and this verse says nothing about their religious affiliations. The people in this section of the chapter were to keep in mind that they had the messenger of God in their midst, and as the messenger, if he were to comply with every desire of theirs, then this would be detrimental to them. Verse 7 speaks of when the prophet showed reluctance to go and fight another tribe, which they initially viewed as a betrayal. He advocated for peace, just as the faithful are instructed to do in verse 9, however their hatred and animosity towards one another was blinding them to see reason. Here, God informs them that if the messenger were to comply with them in a lot of the ordeal, meaning, had he complied with them to fight their brothers, then it would have been detrimental to them, and that his reluctance was in fact a good thing for them. However, once they came to their senses and saw reason, God made faith more attractive to them in their hearts, and made them dislike the suppression of good, shady behavior and disobedience, as a gracious bounty from God and a favor. All the verses on the incident essentially culminate at verse 13, where God tells the people that he had created them from a male and a female, and that he had made them into tribes and clans in order that they may know one another. God created people from a male and a female. This is first and foremost in reference to those men and women who saw it fit to defame, slander, backbite, and mock one another by characterizing each other with offensive titles, as we see they did in verses 11 and 12. Here, God is reminding them that they all essentially came from the same source, namely a male and a female. The mere mentioning of this fact seems to suggest that the people might have been making racial and misogynistic or misandristic remarks against one another. The verse informs the members of the aforementioned tribes that they had to squash their squabbles against one another, as those don't really matter in the eyes of God. The differences that exist between tribe, clan, culture, ethnicity, nationality and race, were all placed there by God in order for people to get to know one another. The more multidiverse and accepting of that multidiversity a nation is, the better that nation is in the sight of God. Had all peoples been of one kind, life would surely not have been worth learning about or even enjoying. One of the greatest pleasures that people enjoy is to travel and experience other cultures, and this speaks volumes to the truthfulness and significance of this verse, especially in our times, where there are still so many cultures that are so opposed to integrating and intermingling with other cultures. Now, since Aladdin didn't really comment on the following verses, I will not be commenting on them either, as they seem quite straightforward. I mainly wanted to focus on the beginning of the chapter, as that seemed to be where he lost his train of thought. Let us, however, read through the remaining verses, with the actual context in mind. The verses state, "Now, if two parties from among the faithful are about to fight one another, then make amends between them, and if one of them should rebel against the other, then fight the one which rebels until it returns to the command of God. And if it does return, then make amends between the both of them with justice, and be fair, as assuredly, God does indeed love those who are fair. The faithful are only brethren, so make amends between your brethren, and do keep God in mind, in hope that you might perchance attain mercy. O people of the faith, let not a people ridicule any other people, as it may be that they are better than them, nor should women ridicule any other women, as it may be that they are better than them. Nor should you slander one another, nor characterize one another with offensive titles. Terrible indeed is the malicious name after having had faith. And whoever does not apologize and turn in repentance, then such are they who are the wrongdoers. O people of the faith, avoid a lot of speculation and presumption, as assuredly, some presumptive behavior can indeed be sinful, and do not be intrusive, nor backbite one another. Would one of you like to consume the flesh of his dead brother? You would clearly detest it. Now, do keep God in mind, as assuredly, God is indeed receptive, merciful. O people, most assuredly, we indeed created you from a male and a female, and we made you into tribes and clans in order that you may know one another. Indeed, the most honorable of you in the sight of God are the most cautiously mindful and disciplined among you. Verily, God is indeed knowing, aware. The Bedouin Arabs say, we have faith. Tell them, nay, you have actually not attained faith, but you should instead say we have accepted monotheism. For faith has not yet entered into your hearts. But if you are to obey God and His messenger, He will not diminish anything of your works at all, as assuredly, God is indeed forgiving, merciful. The faithful are only those who put their faith in God and His messenger, and then they did not doubt, and they strove with their wealth and their lives in the path of God. Such people are they who are the credible. Say, are you going to teach God about your approach to servitude, when God knows whatever is in the heavens and whatever is in the earth? For He is of all things, knowing. They take it as a favor to thee that they have accepted monotheism. O Muhammad, tell them, do not consider your acceptance of monotheism as a favor to me, rather, it is God who has conferred a favor upon you, in that He has directed you to faith, if you are to be credible. Assuredly, God does indeed know the unseen of the heavens and the earth, and God is in full view of whatever you do. Now, with the actual context out of the way, let us go through some of the comments that Aladdin presents in his video and see whether they actually stand up to scrutiny. He starts out with his first point being that the Quran is flawed and can be improved, and that it fails its own made-up criteria for divinity. Now, a point to note here, is that the Quran does not contain any such criteria for divinity. What people tend to point to, when they assert such a claim is by pointing to verse 82 of chapter 4, which states, "Will they then not ponder over the Quran, for had it been from other than God, they would have found within it numerous inconsistencies." People typically rush to this verse to support their assertion that the Quran claims to be a perfect book, a claim which in my opinion, the verse does not make. To perhaps give you a clue as to what the verse is referencing, I suggest you really consider where the verse is found and what verses before and after it are talking about. But let us get back to the point he makes. The Quran does not claim that the criteria for its divinity is that it does not contain flaws. That's a silly point to make, and it can only be made by someone who has not really paid much attention to the Quranic polemical discourse. Now, I will give Aladdin a point where he states, a book's eloquence and perfection is subjective and difficult to prove, and these have nothing to do with divinity. This is a point that I can get behind, as there is likewise no Quranic basis for this claim, as it would be absurd to assert such a thing, which again, is why the Quran does not raise this point. This is a point that was perpetuated by Islamic evangelicals in order to win converts to their mission. It was never used as a polemical device by the Prophet in order to convince people that he was a true prophet of God. The following parts of Aladdin's comments are mainly targeting this point, so I don't really need to comment on it, since it is not a point that the Quran makes, rather a point against Sunni Islam, here in particular Sunni evangelists. He states, if there is any room for improvement, then it is imperfect, and if it is imperfect, then it is not from God. That seems like a simple logical argument to follow, and if it were a Quranic argument, then I would concede this point, as I do not believe the Quran to be perfect or even unimprovable. Obviously, there are certain things which we would wish, if they had been in the Quran, it would have made the book a lot more suitable for the audience in our time. Clearly, one cannot make the claim that the Quran fits in our world and time just as it fit the time and the historical context in which it was revealed. In our time, it clearly loses some of its profoundness, impact, meaning, rhythm, and so on, compared to the time when it was first recited by the Prophet. Obviously, those who experienced it did not need a context, as they were in contact with the events that it recounts, so we lose some of that as well. However, the point that it seeks to make is not lost to us. We can still reconstruct what might have been the historical context without it needing to give us a backstory to some, if not most of the events that it recounts. So, in this particular case, one could say that the Quran is lacking in these respects, and I would agree, which again should in of itself point to its imperfect nature. As for the latter part of the statement before, namely, that if it is not perfect, then it is not from God, this is also an absurd claim to make, because the Quran does not make such a claim either. The fact that there is such a thing as abrogation, should already indicate to someone that the Quran is not and cannot be perfect, and that revelation by its nature cannot be perfect. If revelation were perfect, it would never have been left in the hands of man to be corruptible since the beginning of time. Something perfect cannot be corruptible, and revelation is obviously more than corruptible. If the fact alone that a revelation being from God makes it perfect, then we have to ask, were the tablets of Moses containing the commandments, which were handwritten by God, not revealed by God? Do we still have them in their original? To sum up on this point, no, revelation is not perfect, otherwise there would be no such thing as abrogation, whether one believes that to be within Scripture or outside Scripture. Since according to some, the Quran abrogates itself in certain verses, a claim which I reject, this suggests that it is not perfect, or at least that those abrogated verses were not perfect, since they needed to be updated. Similarly, for those, such as myself, who believe that revelations given to later prophets can abrogate revelations given to earlier prophets, this should seem clear that revelation in of itself was never intended to be perfect, even if the Quran is the final revelation. I could comment on Aladdin's take on the verse at this point, however, since his entire commentary on the verse hinges on a failed premise, i.e. the premise of perfection, there is not really much I can say on this issue. In the video, he presents what he sees as an issue of the verse, due to the verse's usage of the term, fursik, claiming that this causes in-group bias, and that it gives license to Muslims to incorrectly or correctly label other people as fursikun, thereby claiming that this shows that the verse is lacking. Similarly, he fails to notice that the context of the verse is actually provided in the chapter itself, which is why the chapter uses the word fursik in the first place, and doesn't just simply say, if there comes to you some information, as he put it. Frankly, this is a very clumsy reading of the text, but let us not get ahead of ourselves. I will, however, respond to this objection with a simple analogy, where I will render the verse with the following substitutions. A father instructs his children, saying, "O my children, if a malicious person comes to you with small talk, then be on your guard, lest you are harmed without knowing, and thereafter become regretful. In this example, the father is fully aware that his children know what a malicious person looks like when he gives them this advice, and they are fully capable of discerning what malice looks like when it is presented before them, and so they are encouraged to be on guard in order to protect themselves. It would be insane of anyone to assume that in this example, the father is informing his children to be skeptical of anyone who approaches them with small talk, including their longtime friends at school or in the playground. Likewise, when a mother informs her child or children, if you see any gang members, then be extra careful and do not engage with them in conversation. In this example as well, the title, gang member, is one that is meant in a negative light, and it is a telltale sign for the child to be wary of while on the street. The parent doesn't simply tell the child, if you see anyone, or if anyone approaches you, then be extra careful, and do not engage them in conversation, as this would be impractical. Rather, the mother specifies as to which people she wants her child to avoid. Similarly, the people in the verse are encouraged to be extra skeptical when a fusik comes to them with information. The fact alone that they are fusik should give the person enough information of the type of information that they have come with. That being that the information is not of good intent. As I have already said, a fusik can come from all walks of life, and can be someone who believes in God and the last day. There is nothing that suggests that just because you happen to believe in God, you cannot be a swindler or a person with malicious intent. Aladdin makes the mistake here in assuming that the Quran is hereby depicting people in a black and white lens, because he assumes that the fusik is the non-Muslim, and the good person is the Muslim. This is a self-constructed lens which he chooses to read the Quran through, and he has absolutely no justification or foundation for it in the text. Why he assumes this faulty line of thinking is beyond comprehension. Does the Quran here state anything about there only being people who are fusikun who are bad? The Quran has a multitude of terms of people whom it views in a negative light. Like fajran, a violent disruptor, or athiman, a sinner, or zaliman, a wrongdoer or unjust person, and yet it didn't use any of these words. It didn't even use the word kafiru or kafirun, a suppressor of good, rather it used fusik, meaning a shady or malicious person. How else would one describe a person who comes to you with false information for the sole intent of causing disruption and discord between you and another individual, if not malicious? Furthermore, if Aladdin had really read the verse within its actual context, and extended his mind just a little, he'd able to see the flaw in his objection. In verse 12, which Aladdin too glosses over, in hope that we don't notice, God informs the people of the faith to not always be suspicious, as some suspicion and presumptive actions can be sinful. Clearly, in this verse, the people of the faith are encouraged to avoid being too suspicious, as some suspicion can in fact be sinful. So how does he align this verse with the part of verse 5, where he assumes the Quran is somehow telling people to be suspicious of everyone by categorizing everyone in groups of a believer and a non-believer? So once again, we can clearly see that no thought went into his objection to the verse. The chapter is clearly informing us to do the exact opposite of what he accuses the Quran of encouraging. This is extremely poor effort on Aladdin's part, as the answers to his objections are all found within the same chapter. Why did he not put these two verses together and attempt to resolve the contradiction between him and the chapter? It would have served him well, however, it was due to a lack of being open-minded enough that led him to this very erroneous understanding. No wonder he quickly glossed over it, so that people wouldn't notice. Now, returning to the flaw in his main point, being suspicious of every information that is given to us is an impossible standard of any human being to maintain. And yet he claims this would be better and timeless compared to the verse in question. This is absolutely absurd, as he is demanding a standard which nobody can uphold. Within the video, he keeps assuming that the verse is unclear and leaves room for much ambiguity, and yet in his own rendition of the verse, there is much room for uncertainty. He renders his verse as follows. O people of the faith, if you are given information, then ascertain, lest you should harm a people out of ignorance, and thereafter become regretful. So, let us take a look at this bulletproof rendition and see if it is in fact more specific or better worded than the verse in the Quran. The first question that we can ask is, what kind of information? Should we be skeptical of all kinds of information or news that we are given? If we are, how can we possibly live up to that standard? Should we investigate any kind of information that is given to us by our teachers in school, our bosses at work, our close friends and family members? How can we then trust each other if we are constantly verifying every single piece of information that we are given? Now, someone may raise an objection here, and claim that Aladdin meant information of a specific kind, and not every single information, and my response to this would be, then he should have specified that, just as he had assumed the verse was lacking. In his scenario, he is leaving the individual to guess as to which kind of information we are supposed to ascertain. It seems that his entire objection is that the verse of the Quran is too specific by calling us to be skeptical of both the information and the carrier of the information, with the carrier being of course highlighted, hence why the verse simply says, then ascertain. It does not say ascertain the information or ascertain the carrier, rather simply ascertain, meaning ascertain everything. You must make sure that the carrier of the information is indeed credible, his credentials, and that the information given is indeed factual. Furthermore, the information intended is connected to the context of the verse, to both what comes before and after the verse. In a situation where there is unease and turmoil, where harm may result, be extra careful with the intel that comes to you, as well as the one who comes in with that intel. He then spends the next minutes going through the supposed context of the verse, namely the non-Quranic reference titled Asbab Nuzul, which is the assumed reasoning for the revelation, which was invented to try and explain for what led up to the revelation of certain verses of the Quran. This is the part of the video where the character assassination and attacks on the Prophet come in, so I will not be dealing with much of it in my response, as it really has nothing to do with the verse. It is merely meant to push the tired old narrative that the Prophet Muhammad was bad, violent, and an evil man, blah blah blah. In the video, he clearly acknowledges that there are multiple versions of the story, and yet he finds the information therein conclusive enough to use in attacking the Prophet. He doesn't question the credibility of the sources, he doesn't scrutinize the story to see whether the story aligns with the chapter, but again, whatever promotes your agenda, I guess. As to the question of context, I have already let the Quran speak for itself, and I leave the rest up to the individual who is watching. I will end my response in somewhat the same light as he did his. Read the chapter carefully as a whole, and then really ask yourself, does what he presented really stand up to reason, and does it really align with the chapter? Does what he provided as historical context really cover every verse, or just a bunch of contradictory patched-up stories from here and there, which don't even have any connection to one another? It does not seem like he took his own advice of being skeptical of all information. Just because the information is found in extra Quranic Muslim sources, that doesn't mean that you must take it at face value as representing what really took place during the time of the Prophet. It would have been better, had he said that there exists multiple contradictory versions of the story, so take it with a grain of salt, and not as factually representing what actually happened. Another thing that might have served him well in this video as well as other videos which he has done, where he criticizes the Prophet's character and calls him all kinds of evil names under the sun, would have been, if he actually specifies that his sources are only found in the Sunni sources. This is unfortunately a staple of almost all ex-Muslims, specifically those who are public about their apostasy. It is dishonest of someone who carries themselves as neutral and factual representative, to only then present one side of the argument and pretend that that represents the whole. For example, at multiple occasions, he has unapologetically referred to the Prophet as a pedophile, because within Sunni sources, there are mentions of him having married Aisha at a young age. However, the mistake that he makes is that he presents this as historical fact, probably not knowing that the Shiites do not hold the same view and that they do not have the same accounts, and yet he presents this as representing Islam. This is so poor of him, especially for someone who constantly says that he only wants to present the truth. If your intent is to provide the truth about Islam, and nothing but that, then present all the sources that represent Islam, not just the Sunni tradition. And if you do not know the traditions of other folds of Islam, then at least mention that this is strictly representing Sunni Islam, and not Islam as a whole, as you are marginalizing and excommunicating a whole group of people from the fold of Islam by using these as the actual representations of the religion of Islam. Perhaps take your own advice in your next video, and be more thorough and more factual. Anyway, that would be it for now. I do not know if I will continue making these types of videos, as they get kind of repetitive, but only time will tell. Anyway, as always, stay safe everyone. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.